no airport, no regular flights, one cargo ship roughly once every 2 months, and that's the only link to the rest of the world. By the end of this video, you'll know why around 450 people live on what's considered the most isolated inhabited island in French Polynesia, an island so remote it developed its own language. You'll see mountain ridges covered in stone fortresses built by people defending themselves against each other, centuries before anyone from the outside world ever arrived. You'll see why a single cargo ship's schedule determines almost everything about daily life here. And you'll see how a council of 7 elders still governs land and tradition on an island most maps barely have room to label. This is the story of Rapa Iti, the island so far from everywhere that it had to build its own rules. This is Rapa Iti, home to roughly 450 people and widely considered the most remote inhabited island in all of French Polynesia. It sits more than 1,000 kilometers southeast of Tahiti, and the nearest inhabited island, Reo is another 500 kilometers away in the opposite direction. There is no airport here, and there never has been. The only regular connection to the outside world is a single cargo ship, the Tuha Pei 4, which makes the journey from Papeete roughly once every 2 months, carrying fuel, food, mail, medicine, and virtually everything else the island cannot produce for itself. Between those visits, Rapa Iti is, in every practical sense, on its own. The island itself looks almost nothing like the postcard image most people associate with French Polynesia. Rapa Iti is the eroded remnant of an ancient volcanic caldera, and its topography reflects that violent origin. Jagged, near vertical ridgelines rise straight out of a deeply indented coastline, cut through with narrow bays and steep valleys, climbing to Mont Perot, the island's highest peak, at 650 meters. There's no gentle, sloping beachfront here the way there is on so many other Pacific islands. The land itself seems to actively resist easy settlement, rising sharply in every direction from the water's edge. That terrain shapes the weather as much as it shapes the landscape. Rapa Iti sits far enough south of the tropics that its climate runs noticeably cooler and stormier than the postcard image of French Polynesia, with the same subtropical depressions and cyclone systems that occasionally batter New Zealand, capable of reaching this far north into the Pacific as well. Steep, funnel-shaped valleys concentrate wind and rain in ways flatter islands never experience, and the same jagged topography that produced natural fortress positions for centuries of pei building also means weather can shift abruptly from one side of the island to the other. A genuine hazard for the small outrigger canoes and fishing boats that remain central to daily life here. And yet people have lived here for roughly 8 centuries, arriving as part of the final major wave of Polynesian eastward expansion around the year 1200, likely connected to earlier settlers of the Marquesas and Society Islands. What they built on this small, mountainous, resource-limited island is one of the most remarkable defensive landscapes anywhere in the Pacific. Rather than settling in open, undefended villages along the coast, Rapa Iti's early inhabitants carved entire mountain ridges into fortified strongholds, known locally as Pi. More than 30 of these hill forts have been identified across the island, featuring deep rock-cut ditches, layered stone breastworks, and terraced defensive positions built along the most commanding high ground available. It's the second densest concentration of this kind of fortification found anywhere in the Pacific, surpassed only by Easter Island, thousands of kilometers away. That density of fortresses on such a small island tells its own story. Archaeologists studying Rapa Iti believe the sheer number of pei reflects a period of serious conflict, likely driven by the pressure of a growing population competing for genuinely limited resources on an island only about 40 square kilometers in total area, land and sea combined. Communities that once might have lived in a handful of open villages instead retreated to fortified positions, some housing what amounted to entire settlements behind their walls. The most extensively studied of these, a site known as Morongo, Utah, reveals a level of defensive engineering, complex approach routes, staged fortifications, elevated lookout points that suggest conflict here wasn't occasional or symbolic. It was a sustained, serious threat that shaped how an entire island chose to live for generations, centuries before anyone from Europe ever charted these waters. What eventually ended that era of conflict wasn't outside intervention, but a devastating collapse of the island's own population, brought on by disease and upheaval following first contact with European ships in the 19th century. Entire fortified communities that had held their ground for generations were reduced to a fraction of their former size within decades, and many of the Pa'e that once housed thriving settlements were abandoned almost overnight, left to the elements as survivors regrouped into a much smaller number of coastal villages. That deep history still shapes life on Rapa Iti today in ways that go beyond archaeology. The island maintains a distinctive, layered system of governance found almost nowhere else in French Polynesia. Alongside the modern democratically elected mayor's office that administers the island within the wider structure of French Polynesian local government, Rapa Iti retains a traditional council of 7 elders, known as the To'ohitu, which holds real, recognized authority over land allocation and cultural matters. Decisions about who has rights to which stretches of land, decisions rooted in genealogy, custom, and generations of accumulated local knowledge still run through this council rather than through conventional municipal channels alone. It's a rare example of a traditional governing structure surviving intact alongside, rather than being replaced by, a modern administrative system. That dual system isn't just symbolic. Disputes over customary land that's often been held by the same extended families for generations without ever passing through a formal French-style title system, are still worked out through the To'ohitu's own processes, drawing on oral genealogy and community consensus rather than a written deed. In a place this small and this isolated, where the same handful of extended families have shared this land for centuries, that kind of dispute resolution carries a weight and a legitimacy that an outside court sitting 1,000 kilometers away in Papeete simply couldn't replicate. Isolation this extreme and this prolonged has shaped the island in another way that's harder to see from the outside, but immediately obvious the moment you actually speak with residents. Rapa Iti has its own distinct language, Reo Rapa, related to but clearly distinguishable from the Tahitian spoken across most of French Polynesia. On an island group where Tahitian functions as something close to a regional lingua franca, Rapa Iti's population has maintained a genuinely separate linguistic identity, a direct consequence of centuries spent further from everywhere else than almost any other inhabited place in the entire South Pacific. Most residents today speak Reo Rapa, alongside French and Tahitian, moving between all three depending on who they're talking to and what the conversation calls for. Daily life on the island runs almost entirely on what the island and surrounding waters can provide directly, supplemented by whatever the Tuha Pay for brings roughly every 2 months. Fishing remains central to the local economy and diet, drawing on waters that, unlike much of the rest of French Polynesia, see relatively little outside fishing pressure, simply because almost no outside vessels have any reason to come this far south. Small-scale agriculture fills in the rest, taro and other traditional crops grown on whatever terraced, workable ground the island's steep terrain allows, a farming approach that echoes the same careful use of limited land that produced those mountainside fortresses centuries earlier. Handicrafts, particularly weaving and carving, round out both the local economy and the island's cultural life. Skills passed down through families in a place where almost nothing about daily survival can be outsourced or bought in easily. Housing and construction follow the same self-reliant pattern. Building materials that residents elsewhere would simply order and receive within days have to be requested on one shipping cycle and received, if all goes well, on the next, competing for limited cargo space with fuel and food. Families here have learned to stockpile essential materials well ahead of need, treating the ship's schedule as a planning constraint built into nearly every decision involving anything the island itself can't produce. The island's isolation has also made it a genuine point of interest for researchers well beyond archaeology, because Rapa Iti's population has remained so small, so stable, and so geographically isolated for so long. Medical researchers have studied the community for insights into health and genetics that are difficult to find almost anywhere else on Earth. Communities this consistent, this traceable, and this cut off from the broader gene flow of the wider Pacific are exceptionally rare. That same isolation that makes daily logistics so difficult has, from a scientific standpoint, turned Rapa Iti into something close to a natural laboratory, though residents themselves would likely put it more simply. This is just what life looks like when your nearest neighbor is 500 kilometers away. Satellite internet has slowly begun reaching even islands this remote in recent years, offering a genuine, if often slow and expensive, link to family and services elsewhere in French Polynesia. It hasn't replaced the ship, since no amount of bandwidth can deliver fuel or a replacement engine part, but it's narrowed slightly the emotional distance isolation has always imposed here. That 2-month gap between supply ships shapes nearly every practical decision made on Rapa Iti. A medical need beyond what the island's small clinic can handle means waiting, sometimes for weeks, for transport to somewhere with real hospital care, a mechanical part for essential equipment, a specific medication, replacement materials for storm damage. All of it depends on timing a request correctly against a shipping schedule that does not bend for individual emergencies. In genuinely life-threatening situations, evacuation depends on arranging an emergency flight to a neighboring island with an actual airstrip, a costly, slow process that can take a full day or more to organize even once approved, since no aircraft is ever simply standing by on an island with no runway to receive one. Families here plan purchases, repairs, and even travel for education or medical care around that same rigid 2-month rhythm, treating the ship's arrival less as a delivery and more as a recurring deadline that the rest of life has to be built around. Education, past a certain level, presents one of the starkest examples of what that isolation actually costs. With no secondary school of real scope on an island this small, teenagers reaching a certain age typically have to leave for Tahiti to continue their studies, boarding with relatives or in student housing 1,000 kilometers from home, accessible only by that same infrequent ship, or, for genuine emergencies, an extremely costly and difficult to arrange flight from a neighboring island with an airstrip of its own. Parents on Rapa Iti often go months without seeing their own children during the school year, a trade-off nearly every family with school-age kids eventually has to accept, since there simply is not a version of secondary education that does not involve sending them somewhere else. It's a decision every family on Rapa Iti eventually faces, weighing a child's education against months, sometimes years, of physical separation on an island where even a phone call home has depended, until relatively recently, on limited and unreliable connectivity. And yet, much like so many of the world's most isolated communities, Rapa Iti's population hasn't dwindled toward abandonment, despite every incentive that isolation creates to leave. Roughly 450 people continue to call this remote, mountainous, historically embattled island home, maintaining fishing traditions, agricultural practices, a distinct language, and a governing structure that predates French administration entirely, all sustained across a stretch of ocean so vast that the nearest neighbor is still 500 kilometers away in any direction. Every one of those adaptations points to the same underlying reality. Rapa Iti hasn't solved isolation so much as built an entire way of life designed to absorb it, the same way its ancestors once built mountain fortresses designed to absorb conflict they knew was coming. So what does it actually take to keep a genuinely distinct culture, language, and way of life alive on an island this far from everything else, generation after generation, with nothing more than a cargo ship every couple of months connecting it to the rest of the modern world? Maybe the answer is written directly into the island's own landscape, in those 30-plus stone fortresses still standing on its ridgelines, long before anyone here had ever heard of an airport, a supply ship, or a colonial government. The people of Rapa Iti had already proven they knew how to build something that could hold, on their own terms, against whatever came.